DEATHinitely wants to take death seriously so you don't have to, creating a safe and inclusive space that tackles the mundane, profound, and crazy parts of death that you don't feel like asking anywhere else. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go! Part of that world.
Part of the funeral world.
You ruined it.
Too close to your face. Just at a distance.
Okay.
Not too close.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to count you in. You ready?
Yeah.
5, 4, 3, 2.
Welcome and thank you for being here for this episode of DEATHinitely, the show that takes death seriously so you don't have to. I'm your host, Allison Danger, your internet death daddy, your resplendent of the reposed, and your cadaverous constable who's on a quest to learn everything about death and pass that knowledge along to you at the Death Dissertation of Life, the scholastic slideshow for your ears. On today's episode, we're going to cover something called DEATH-ICS, or death ethics, or the ethics of death. And with me, as always, is producer-editor Jordan.
Hi. That's it. That's all you got is hi.
Wow, he's
Sorry.
on it today.
I'm on a roll.
On it.
I'm ready to talk about death and the deathics of ethics.
It's going to be a hard one for you because I think I could really reel you in with some of the really cool stuff before, but ethics is kind of dry, but I find it fascinating. So I'll try and intrigue you with my death knowledge of deathics.
Well, as my favorite ethics teacher, Chidi Anagonye, once said, I don't have a good quote.
Put the peeps in the chili pot.
I just wanted to say his name. I watch stuff on TV.
Today's trigger warning. DEATHinitely is a show that talks about death. In this episode, we mention types of death that some may find difficult, like medical-assisted dying, abortion, traumatic death, and other difficult end-of-life choices and posthumous care. If any of these things are difficult for you, or you have just suffered a loss, please take care while listening.
What's your opening topic today?
We're talking about the business side of death ethics, or the deathics of business.
Whenever you say death ethics, are you going to say deathics right after?
I don't know, maybe.
Okay,
it's
so
kind of fun.
We should have a counter that says every time Allison says death ethics.
He's going to put in a little noise every time I say deathics. It's going to go bing, bing. You guys will get really annoyed.
Let's see how long it takes for us to completely alienate your audience.
Oh, no, don't do that.
I won't do that to you.
Okay. Bing, deathics. Sorry, guys. First things first. What the hell are ethics? Or in this case,
deathics.
Bing! Death ethics, or the ethics of death, are the moral principles that are employed to help make informed and righteous decisions about the end of life or death choices. Righteous, yes, exactly like you would say as an 80s hero a la Zach Morris on Saved by the Bell, not righteous as in religious. A big misconception here is that ethics and morals are a list of do's and don'ts that people ought to abide by, which is a bit misleading. Ethics and morals are a set or a type of thinking surrounding, in our case, death or the topic. Different ethical or moral styles of thought and approach can lead to many different answers to important questions. So let's make this a little more user-friendly. If ethics are, quote, moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity, end quote, and morals are, quote, a person's standards of behavior or beliefs concerning what is and is not acceptable for them to do, end quote, according to the Oxford Dictionary. Deathics are mine or your standards of how it is or is not acceptable to die, plainly speaking. Does that make sense, Jordan?
Actually, there's a lot of words in there and there's a lot of quotes, unquotes, but yeah, that's actually pretty easy to follow along.
Yeah, it's just a set of standards that talks about a general population and how it's socially acceptable to die or not die. Ethics are a thought experiment that you didn't consent to being a part of when you are stressed about making decisions that hold a lot of weight. Fun stuff. Harkening back to our Death Lexicon episode, death and dying are not the same thing, and this is important to remember for the discussion of ethics in particular, because ethics apply to processes and not events. So it would be odd or deviant, you could say, that we're discussing the ethics of death because it's an event, not a process. Odder still is that the ethics that surround the event of death, the ultimate moment of life's cessation, we spend many hours discussing how to quicken or slow death, prevent it, versus inflicting death, and all those things that hold ethical merit. It all kind of makes my brain hurt, but for the ethicist out there that might be listening, I did my homework, my dude. I did my homework. So how can we examine deathics? How can we apply this to something like posthumous care, the business operation in the death care industry. We're going to have to look at the event of death and the process of moving the needle on the timeline of when and how that happens. We're going to have to use motive, intention, and perspective to light the way through this dark part of the ethical death forest.
The ethical death forest.
Did you know that there's a forest called the Black Forest in Germany?
Yep.
Side note, it's not really, and everybody thinks that's where Black Forest cake came from, but really Black Forest cake came from Canada. It didn't come from Germany and the Black Forest, and it has to do with like Canadian interpretation of cake and not a German forest.
I came to this podcast for death ethics and all of those questions that
and I
need to be answered.
also have facts about cake.
This is not the cake ethics.
Cake ethics?
Cake ethics. Cake ethics. The ethics of cake. Welcome to my podcast.
We're here to talk about cake. The other thing to keep in mind as we summon the much smarter than me from the ethical pantheon is that the study of ethics at its core is a discussion. It's a way to argue, or it's an infrastructure to hang a difficult problem on, not exactly how to solve that particular problem. Ethics is like a continuum. It's like a scale or a spectrum. It's not a dichotomy. It's not yes or no, right or wrong, light or dark. We can use things like Kantian ethics, utilitarian thought, or virtue ethics, among others, to help figure out your moral conundrum. Better still, if all of these different ways to examine an ethical problem were to give you the same answer, you know you're probably on a really great track. Let's put motive, intention, and perspective into play. We can all agree that murdering someone or taking someone's life preemptively is ethically wrong. What do you think, Jordan?
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't murder. So it's how we ought not to act. Cars are big, powerful death machines. So let's say that you are driving down a city street, Jordan, and you hit a pedestrian and kill them. Are you ethically or morally responsible for their death?
Allison.
Yes.
I didn't come here
to be quizzed about my personal ethics.
Don't question me on my ethics. I only want to edit and produce your podcast.
Okay,
so am I ethically responsible for their death? Well, yeah, I'm driving the death machine. I'm driving the car. Of course I am.
But ethicists would say it depends. Let's dig a little deeper. Let's say that the person you hit and killed was crossing the street on their phone and stepped in front of you without looking. So we're informing the situation a little bit more. Are you still ethically at fault? It's getting a little murkier. How about if the pedestrian jumped in front of you and had a suicide note found in their pocket? Are you still at fault? What about if you were driving under the influence? Does that change how you are ethically responsible? What about if you swerved to miss a kid chasing a ball and hit a grandma? What if you intentionally hit someone who cheated on you? All of a sudden, the water is muddy and murky with motive, intention, and perspective, and answering it is or isn't how someone should act becomes a much more difficult question to answer. All of a sudden, you hitting somebody with your car has a really difficult connotation to it. Well, people have an anthropological necessity to categorize things. Good versus evil ethics are misleading. The reality is that there isn't a line that separates one answer as all good and one as all bad. Ethics aren't true or false, they are a continuum or a scale. Side note, while listening to Dr. Adam Frank, astrobiologist and physicist, on a podcast I love, he taught me that the line that separates the day and the night, or the light and the dark on a celestial body, is called the terminator. So if you want to make studying ethics insanely more fun, think of the line you would draw between what is ethical and unethical as Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator from the movie Terminator.
I'll be back.
So while we talked about Kantian utilitarianism or virtue ethics, I'm going to leave looking up how these methods of ethical discussion differ for you, so that this doesn't turn into an ethics lesson, which it is already on the cusp of becoming. So, deathics of death means examining business ethics, the ethics of medically assisted dying and end-of-life choices, death autonomy, and posthumous care. Let's dig into the deathics of business. One area that gets a lot of attention in the public forum is business ethics. While Ontario, where we're from, is one of the most highly regulated places in North America for contractual law surrounding death care, these rules are, like so many, there for a reason. Sneaky business practices, lack of transparency, lack of equality, high-pressure sales, etc., have all been present in the death care space previously. While these are exceptions, not the norm, these few bad apples sour the whole bunch. The terrible, verging on horrific stories you see come across the news desk are usually from a much less regulated place in the US, and it usually has to do with posthumous care practices, but we'll get there in a second. A lot of people will look to the seminal works of Jessica Mitford entitled The American Way of Death for an in-depth examination of the funeral or death care industry. This book paints an unfortunate and frankly outdated view of modern death care. First published in 1963, she raised some valid and concerning points about death care business practices. And the book really did usher in the area of funeral legislature and best practices, which is a good thing. The error comes when people read this work as a current view or investigation of the business practices of the death care industry. And this is especially prominent for those that work in Ontario. These things have changed in the world in the last 60 years. Seatbelts are now mandatory. You can't smoke in just any old wear you want. And helmets are for everyone. And typing on a computer that fits in your house is all normal stuff. The same thing can be said of the death care industry's business ethics. They have come a long way from the time of Jessica Mitford. I guess when it comes to money, business practices, and ethical business operations, there are standards across all areas of sales and services that are relatively clear to most people these days. Making clear lines on the ethics front when it comes to money and business is much less emotional and personal than some of the other death care industry ethical challenges. I'm by no means saying death care is perfect, but gone are the days when unethical business practices were the norm, and the Mitford novel was an indictment of the death care industry. A lot can change in 60 years, but I also understand that there are a lot of places that are not as highly regulated as Ontario is, and that some of these issues might still be outside of legally bound to the industry. The second area we're going to examine is MAID, M-A-I-D, and end-of-life choices. MAID stands for, in Canada, Medical Assistance in Dying, but it can also be referred to as PAD, P-A-D, Physician-Assisted Dying, Euthanasia, or Assisted Suicide in other parts of the world. Does what we call it matter? Yeah, it does. Words have meaning and value to a person, and terms like euthanasia and assisted suicide can have some really negative connotations carried over from a period before MAID was legalized. As of 2022, there are 11 countries around the world that have made MAID, or PAD, available under a set of various circumstances. Differing country to country, most of them will not accept non-citizens, so don't plan your last trip or your last hurrah to Luxembourg for their PAD services. Side note, the countries that have passed end-of-life medical services are Austria, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, Canada, Colombia, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as 11 US states. Various countries have passed legislation that allows the withdrawal of life-sustaining or saving treatments, but continue to vote down MAID or PAD services. A great ethical question that is sure to start a food fight around the dinner table tonight is there a difference in passive and active end-of-life treatment from an ethical or moral viewpoint?
For a second there, Allison, I thought you were going to look over at me and go, "Hey, Jordan, is there a difference in passive and active end-of-life treatment? Because you seem to
called you out earlier?
Yeah, so I was just like, I'm on guard. I was ready to answer the question. Don't ask me the question. I was ready to answer the question. But
you don't want to.
Don't ask me.
Okay.
And now back to DEATHinitely.
Some of the core ethical principles of DEATH-ICS and dying are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, dignity, truthfulness. It isn't an exhaustive list, but it's a decent start. The short end of this is, when it comes to the business ethics of working in the death care industry, be honest, transparent, truthful, and educate your clients on what options are out there so that they leave feeling cared for. It's called death care for a reason. The really big biggie here is that we are looking at the ethics of death through the lens of a living person. Well, how could we not? Should ethics be specific to the living and the dead separately? Is there a separate need or want for deceased treatment to be different than that of a living person, with the exception of life-saving techniques? Where's the line of the living and the dead? Is it the medical definition? Is it the legal definition? Is it the religious definition? But there are plenty of philosophies and philosophers that have ideas about the intrinsic value of death, be it positive or negative, or just plain old neither. This gets all the crazier when we have to apply these ideas to posthumous harm and the medical ethics.
Allison?
Yeah.
Can we talk about medical ethics of dying?
Sure we can. Before we go too far down the grave hole or rabbit hole, it's important to remember that talking about ethics and philosophy is only as strong or as effective as we have opposing opinions. While some of these opposing opinions can be wild and to some or most inappropriate or go against the law or public opinion, rigorous debate about topics are important. Side note, a tenet of philosophical debate is the ability to take your own beliefs, thoughts, ideas, and predictions and challenge them. When presented with challenges to our point of view, we will either refute the challenges and strengthen our resolve or re-examine our own philosophies and grow as a person. Being a truly philosophical person means having your point of view frequently challenged, refuting or growing, and continuing onward in life. It's not just deep thinking. In a journal article entitled Death, Posthumous Harm and Bioethics by a PhD and professor named James S. Taylor, he argues that there's no such thing as posthumous harm. He uses different philosophical ideologies and interpretations based on widely accepted philosophers' understanding of what death is or can be. He invokes names like the almighty Aristotle, Epicurus, and Kant, as well as J.S. Mill. He does shrewdly point out that most of our medical ethics have some Aristotelian, you want to say that, Jordan? Aristotelian values, but that death ethics as they are currently pull almost exclusively from Kant or Mill. Without having a full-blown philosophy of ethics class here, let's just go on and say, watch The Good Place or read Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. It'll get you there. The big question here is, should we treat the dead like the living? And where do you draw the line, if at all, between that care? Is healthcare and death care the same thing without intrinsically trying to save or maintain a human life? There are lots of instances when deceased people ought to be treated as alive, but there are many that aren't so clear. An example of this could be if someone is pronounced dead, but is still breathing and heart beating on a machine. Is it ethically okay to harvest their organs if they or their next of kin have consented? Medical ethics is a dice game when it comes to the care of the dead and the dying. Medicine and the line between life and death gets really tricky, and it would be a lie to say that everyone or even anyone might agree on exactly where that line is. When you're asked about medical ethics and in their relation to dying and eventual death, it might conjure up thoughts of saying goodbye to an aged loved one that's lived a happy and full life. Maybe it draws up thoughts of suicide attempts or that friend from school that never made it through. Medical ethics as they pertain to death are messy. We struggle to talk about death, something that none of us will escape from, but even more difficult when it's sudden, traumatic, or unnatural. How do we begin to talk about those? How do we try and make rules as a city or a province, a state or a nation about the right way to die? Difficult topics that fall under the medical ethics of dying would be things like abortion, the death penalty, wartime deaths and military field treatment, suicide, medical assisted dying, futility in medical care, organ transplant or harvest, informed consent, traumatic response care, large-scale crisis triage. No one wants to think about these things because they are all admittedly terrible. But if we refuse to talk about them in hypothetical sense, how ill-prepared are we going to be with little or no framework to operate under when one of these bad things happen to someone? It all starts with a conversation. We have to have people from opposing ideas and backgrounds talk about why they feel the way that they do, and then we can talk about these difficult death-related things. Ethics in medicine can ask you who has the authority and over who. How does the tradition inhibit change? How do we maintain industry standards while also championing autonomy in death? Do we allow the liberties and actions and procedures to exercise constraint on how someone is to follow the rules in and out of death care? How do we celebrate the individuals that have died while also maintaining a community standard? Lots of questions, not a lot of answers. But ethics give you a framework to have that conversation.
Allison, is death a bad thing?
The philosophy of death for some of the great minds of the past and present. Epicurus said that good and bad are interpreted sensations. Since death is the complete and utter lack of sensation, then it can't be good or bad, because the dead can't feel anything. This is known as the dead end argument. Death marks the end of our ability to be harmed or benefited. Epicurus would say, no, it's neither bad nor good, because you can't feel it. An excerpt from 10,000 Bodies Later states, the philosopher Gautama, better known to most people as the Buddha, postulated that we neither exist nor do not exist. Most people are not elevated to true enlightenment or happiness as they believe they exist and have a desire for life and not desiring death. If we presuppose that we neither persist nor perish, our death should give us nothing to be unhappy about. This makes my brain hurt, and I think the Buddha and Schrodinger would have made good friends. A philosopher like Socrates thought that not only did we die as people exist, but that the body and soul existed as separate entities. Socrates said that the body was mortal, but that we had it precariously tethered to a soul for a period of our earthly lives. If the soul itself was immortal, then we shouldn't fear death, as we will continue to live eternally. The deprivation thesis argues that death is bad because it deprives us of the good things in life we would have otherwise experienced. Some philosophers argue that death allows us to become our authentic selves by accepting our finitude. Finitude? Finitude? Another weird word today.
Finitude?
Finitude? It doesn't matter. Accepting the finality of our lives.
Nice.
Or that death solves all problems and it is what we were born to do. Maybe the most important takeaway isn't about death. It's asking the question of what it means to live well, and live happy.
So, some people say, what's the meaning of life?
To live well, and live happy?
So then...
There you go. Take that to the bank.
No, what is it? Live,
Back
laugh,
that in.
live, laugh, love?
That's the joke one.
That's not a real thing? That's not the meaning of life? Live, laugh,
it's become kind of memeable. Like there's a very specific kind of person that would have that sign on their wall.
Often contemplated is the meaning of... What's the meaning of death? The great equalizer?
Ooh.
Hi, I'm Jordan Middlebrook. I'll be here all
Wow. Oh, he's turned back on, ladies and gentlemen. He's back. He's very plussed with himself. He's just so pleased.
I'm smiling ear to ear.
Yeah, he's real pleased with himself.
Allison, what are you reading?
I just finished the Corpus Hermeticum, and I just finished a book called On Killing, which is a nonfiction novel by a decorated American veteran, and he discusses the processes in which military people overcome the human innate resistance to killing in combat. It's really, really heavy, and it's really also kind of sad, but it's beautiful when you get to read the words of other veterans on how they carry their kills in their minds and in their hearts. That was my favorite part of that read, was reading how, in their own words, in their own voice, how they described what that did to them and how they carry it. The other one I'm reading for fun, or I just finished, was called On a Pale Horse. It's a novel about a character based on the personification of death in fiction. It was a good read. So if you want to roll that up into a nice, neat little package, ethics, morals, and philosophies can be messy, and worse still when they tackle a difficult topic like death. But these discussions are paramount in understanding an event like death. Find a safe space and safe people and talk about death. None of us get out of here alive, so don't procrastinate. DEATHinitely wants to take death seriously so you don't have to, creating a safe and inclusive space that tackles the mundane, profound, and crazy parts of death that you don't feel like asking anywhere else. Listen, participate, comment, love, learn. I'm just happy you're here. On our next episode, we're getting into phantom fandom, or death and the gothic subculture, on being a fan of something like death. DEATHinitely is an independent show that is recorded on ancestral homes of several Mississauga and Chippewas First Nations. We honor these Indigenous peoples, ancestors, and future generations on this land that we share with reverence and humility. I'm your host, Allison Danger. With me, as always, is Jordan, editor and producer, and music's by Soundbay. Links to reading and research materials and citations can be found in a link on the show notes.
Bye.
Wait, I'm Allison Danger. Thanks for listening to DEATHinitely, the show that takes death seriously so you don't have to.
I never take death seriously.
I know, it bothers me.
I'm on the wrong show.
You're on the right show. I'll convert you.
DEATHinitely. Brought to you by Death.
If you like what you hear on DEATHinitely and want to know more, check out the show notes for all of the social connections and things like citations and links and other internet word noise you might want. You can follow the Instagram for DEATHinitely at DEATHinitelyPod, or you can check out our Patreon, or you can also find it at AllisonDanger.com/DEATHinitely. DEATHinitely is an independent show and is made possible by generous people like you. If you want to know all the things, fun, funny, or funereal, please be sure to subscribe on Spotify.
Talking isn't your first language.
Wow. Or you can join our mint condition, fresh out of the box Patreon for the show and all the goodies that come with it.
DEATHinitely. Brought to you by Death.